So far, we have already prepared both our iOS and our Android applications to run our tests. So from now on, we're going to focus entirely on the test project. We may need to explore a bit more inside of the .NET Standard library as well, but most of the things that we're going to be doing now is going to be performed here on the tests project. So what I want to do right now in this lecture is run a first test. And what I will do is actually run a test that is going to be displaying some additional information that is going to be very handy when we create our actual tests. And that additional information is basically going to explore the tree of elements that exists on a particular view, so we can start to notice how is it that we're going to interact with the application within a test. Before actually doing that though, we have to make sure that our test actually run. And so a good part of this lecture is also going to be us focusing on troubleshooting the tests that we're going to be running. Because I am going to cover a few things here and there that you may have to do to make both the Android and the iOS tests run locally. And so by the end of the lecture, we are finally going to see that tree of elements that I've just mentioned. And so I am going to, here in the app launches test, is going to replace the method from the iApp property that is being called. Instead of calling screenshot, I want to call REPL. And this method right here is going to precisely allow us to open a terminal instance and explore the tree of the elements, the UI elements that exist inside of the view. After this, the next thing that I want to do is enable the tests for both of our projects, the Android and the iOS application. And for that, I am going to navigate over here to the right to the unit test option. If you don't see it, you can always navigate over to View, select Paths, and select Unit Tests. That is if you are on Mac. If you are on Windows, instead of doing that, you will have to right-click on the references folder for your tests, and you will see something like this, a list of projects. You will have to select the two projects that you will be testing, the Android and the iOS one. But here on Mac, I navigate over to this Unit Tests window, right-click on the Test tabs, select Add a Project, and it is in here where I have to select both of the projects, Android and iOS, and click on OK. So now both of these applications are going to be launched whenever I run the tests. And as we have seen, if the app launches successfully, we're going to see this REPL being executed. So as it is right now, let's go ahead and run this test. And for this, on Windows, you can actually right-click on this test and select Test, or from the Text Explorer, just as we see over here on the unit test on Mac, simply select the test, right-click and select Run Test. We're going to see a window appear, in my case down here at the bottom, and we're also going to see the application launch on the corresponding emulators, Android and iOS. Eventually, down below, you will see the results of your tests. And if they were successful, congratulations, you have successfully tested this, and in fact, you may already see a terminal instance be opened. In that terminal instance is where we're going to explore the tree. However, if, like in my case, you see the test failing, there may be something else that you still have to perform. For example, in my case, I will have to open from the tests project the app initializer class, and in here I am actually going to do something very similar to what is commented in here. In both cases, when the Android and the iOS apps are being configured, it says that I may need this small piece of code right here. However, in the case of Android, instead of using the APK file, I am going to use the installed app method. And the install app method is going to require the name of the package of the app that is probably going to be installed on the device. So that means that I will have to go over to my Android project and either right click on it and go to the options and navigate over to Android application and copy the package name, or the package name can also be found on the Android manifest. But just find this package name and you can just close this window already. And that package name is going to have to go right here in the installed app method. This then is going to make sure that when you run the application, this is the package name that is going to be used as we configure the Android application. And on the iOS app, something similar is going to happen. In fact, if I inspect the errors that happened when testing my iOS app, it says that the directory was not found. Notice that by default, when configuring the iOS app, some path to the iOS application is already being used. However, if we navigate over to Finder, and let me open a new window in here, and navigate to that path, so in my case, I will have to go over to, first, of course, my user, then projects, then this project, the Redbooks project, of course, the iOS version, inside of the bin folder, the iPhone simulator, and the debug folder. In here, nowhere to be found is that device builds folder. Instead, I am going to find that .app file that is required right here inside of the debug folder. Here we see the redbooks.ios.app file. This one is the one that the test is trying to find, but it turns out that it's not inside of device builds. So I can close the Finder and I will have to update this app bundle. It is going to be very similar to what we already have down here, at least in my case. So I can just copy that path and paste it right here. But as we saw, there is no device builds, and of course there is no folder inside it. What I will have to do is just use that debug folder and point to this .app file directly. Another thing that you have to double check in case your test is failing is you may remember how in the iOS project, inside of the app delegate, we used this #if evaluation to start the Calabash server just in the debug case. And I told you that this is actually a value that is only set on debug scenarios. And that way, if this is not set in the release scenario, which is the case, it wouldn't be started on release versions of the application, so the application can actually be published to the App Store. But it turns out that it may be the case that it is not defined at all. So what you can do is right-click on the iOS project, go over to Options, and navigate over to Compiler. In here, make sure that the configuration is debug, and take a look at the defined symbols. It may be the case, as it is right now in my case, that there is no test cloud option defined in here. So just add a semicolon at the end and paste this one, enable test cloud. This way, it is now going to be available in debug, but if you take a look at the release, it will not be there. So it won't be used, the test cloud, when the application runs in release. Now, this is actually not something that would make the test fail locally, but that won't allow the test to execute on App Center, which we will eventually test, of course. But I won't bore you much more with the details about what you can do in here. What I will is leave you this source code, a few things that you can try if you find some issues when running your tests. You will of course be able to get this source code either from the resources of this lecture as the zip file or from the GitHub repository. For example, if your Android application fails when using this installed app method, as mine is doing right now, you could try and uncomment this line that I've just left in here, so you use APK file instead. Just make sure that you change perhaps the package name and maybe the name of the application. This is basically a relative path to the APK file that gets generated when the Android app is built, relative to the test project. So basically you will have to navigate away from that directory and into this other one. In case you have issues with the JDK, the Java Development Kit, you may need to uncomment this line in here so the settings from your IDE, from where the JDK is located, are used. If you're having some issues when the iOS application may not be running or the simulator may not be starting, you may need to find the identifier for one of your simulators. You can do that directly from Xcode and uncomment this line right here and paste the identifier in here. So a few things here and there that you can test. However, I don't want to bore you too much with this anymore. What I want to show you is what a successful test looks like, especially now that we are calling the REPL method, that, as I mentioned, is going to allow us to explore the tree of elements displaying on the user interface. So from the unit test view over here to the right, I am going to test my iOS app so I don't have to change too much more here for my Android project. At the end of the day, after all, they are both going to be doing exactly the same. And as this test runs, we are of course going to see the application run, but we've seen that before. The interesting thing, at least for this lecture, is that this terminal instance is going to be opened. This is the REPL. This is where we can start to explore that tree of elements. And all we really have to do in here is execute tree, literally. And you can see how indeed we see that tree of elements that exists inside of the view. UI buttons and UI button labels and the text that is inside, some bar buttons as well for that add button that we have in the top right corner. And this right here is how in the next lecture we're going to be able to simulate tabs. We're going to be able to execute a tab of one of these buttons, the login or the add button, and the UI test is going to handle that tab. And so we're going to be able to start creating actual tests. Now our application is not that complicated, our tests are going to be very simple, but we are going to be creating a couple of tests so we can start uploading them over to App Center. So hopefully by the end of this lecture you have already successfully run one of your tests at least and see this window appear. This one, we're going to be using it in the next lecture to create our first actual test, one that can actually simulate some interaction with the user interface. And by the way, right now to complete the test, all you have to do is close this window and it will complete the test. And because we are not really asserting anything right now, it's going to be marked as successful. Of course, in the next lecture, we're going to see how we can actually make some evaluations to see if the test succeeds or if it fails.